some measure of inequality is essential.
I think if either of us were in a fire, whatever the fire brigade said, we would leave the burning building. It just seems the common sense thing to do.
I don't support the Human Rights Act, and I don't believe in economic and social rights.
Originally, I was going to do a video on this man,
Mr. Anderson.
but the more I delved into what he was saying and then reflected upon what others had said, I actually realised this is something much, much bigger than Mr. Anderson. This is a political philosophy that lots of people are voting for, and it's against their very interest. And because
Mr. Anderson.
he's based in Nottingham, I had even found some footage of Brian Clough and just wanted to show the juxtaposition, and part of the reason for that was because I found loads of interesting quotes from the people in Nottingham showing they were completely disgusted by
Mr. Anderson.
However, this became a lot deeper, and what I really found was that this is systemic within the Tory party leadership and some of the backbenchers. They think people on benefits are scroungers, and we're going to go and detail actually who those people are and those benefits, as well as pointing out time and time again people like Mr. Anderson, as well as Dominic Raab, Boris Johnson, and Jacob Rees-Mogg. So two things to say. First of all, likes are free. If you hit that like button, the more likes, the more YouTube promotes my videos. And the more my videos are promoted, the more coffee I can buy. And the more coffee I can have, the more videos I can make to help put people off voting Tory. And all it costs is nothing. And the second thing is, at the very end of this video, you are going to see Boris Johnson take an IQ test. And boy, is it funny, and does it feel good to have it thrown right back in his face. Now have a listen to what
Mr. Anderson
wants to do to poor people who probably need more than anything else some level of help, social care, finances. This is what he wants to do to them.
Banging on about nuisance tenants throughout this lovely estate on Corsica, and but they've got to live somewhere. That's right. So my plan would be, and again this is just my own personal opinion, is that these people who have to live somewhere, let's have them in a tent in the middle of a field, 6 o'clock every morning. Let's have them up, let's have them in the fields, picking potatoes or any current seasonable vegetables, back in the tent, cold shower, lights out, 6 o'clock, the same the next day. That would be my solution.
What
Mr. Anderson
is requesting is a gulag. Forced labour camps from the Soviet era and under Putin, where you are subjected to backbreaking labour, extreme weather, and disease. Now, to give a little bit more context to Brian Clough, he was a football manager, he was extremely famous for his day, he won a lot of trophies, and he was a big socialist and supported the Labour Party. He's also famous in Nottingham for his football work, as well as work in the community, and this is what he had to say about someone like Mr. Anderson.
People who I've met sometimes with a few bob and who've got on don't think everybody else should have a few bob and get on. I think the opposite. I think everybody can have it. And that's where socialism comes from.
You couldn't get more of an opposite between Brian Clough's point of view and that of
Mr. Anderson.
This is Steve Bray. He's crowdfunded to annoy certain right-wing members of the government and has had several arguments with
Mr. Anderson.
This is what Steve had to say about one of his last altercations with Mr. Anderson.
Lee Anderson is very derogatory about those less fortunate in life. The fact he tries to imply I am a tramp and on benefits is insulting those people that actually are. This is what the Tories generally feel about those without wealth. They feel that they are superior. The reality is that they are the lowest of the low. To lie, cheat and steal from the people they are supposed to serve is a true value of their worth.
And here is that altercation.
Afternoon, Mr. Anderson. Are you going to back a liar, Mr. Anderson? You're going to lose your job if you back a liar. You know that, don't you, Mr. Anderson? At least I've got a job to lose. You haven't got one. Hey, my job's annoying and holding people like you to account.
Listen, you're nothing but a parasite with a established that, who astounds you. Why are you here every day dressed like a tramp? Why don't you do a job?
Are you saying people that don't work, people that haven't got a job, are you being derogatory to them?
In fact, I'll rephrase that. If you sport yourself, you make a good tramp.
Now clear off, is it? People fund me to do this. Do you know why?
Because it's taps.
No, because they cannot stand liars, cheats, charlatans, fraudsters and con artists, people like yourself in office.
How many votes did you get in the general election? How many votes did you get in the general election?
It's not about me, it's about you. You are in office, Lee Anderson. and you lie time and time again. And the people are sick of you. They are sick of your lying arsehole of a Prime Minister.
Stop claiming benefits.
Hey, wait a minute.
Go up to Ashfield and get a proper job.
Hey, wait a minute. I'm not on benefits. Work that one out.
And there you have it again. He goes off on one talking about people being on benefits and obviously suggesting that if you're on benefits, that's a negative. This man is such a dinosaur. It's unreal. And yet people have voted him in, despite the fact that they used to love and adore Brian Clough, whose views are completely the opposite of this man. Now, what I find particularly awful about all of this is twofold. The first is, we all pay taxes. Those taxes go to the government and they're meant to put some aside in case we cannot work for whatever reason. It's an insurance scheme, national insurance, and yet he's now saying that even though we pay in, if we take out, we're a scrounger. That for me is highly problematic. That for me sounds like a complete and utter con. The second thing would be connected to who is taking this money out. So I went to the DWP and found a list of what's being taken out from the state in order to support people on low income in poverty. So 2.7 million are claiming for PIP, personal independence payment. That is because you've got some sort of illness or disability that restricts your amount of work that you can do, and the government supports you with that, potentially throughout your entire life. Are they scroungers to Mr. Anderson? Employment support allowance. That is to help people who are below the state pension age, who are having difficulty finding work because they're having long-term medical conditions or a disability. And essentially it's a basic income replacement benefit. There's the disability living allowance. Does Mr. Anderson consider that to be some form of scrounging? There's 1.3 million claiming carers allowance, which hasn't gone up with inflation, but essentially means that you are at home, you're the primary carer of someone and having to look after them, because the state's not going to help you out. They provide some money, but it's not enough. There are millions of people that need help and support, and the views of Mr. Anderson appear to be that of, if you take any money from the state, you're a scrounger. But this isn't the end of Mr. Anderson, because he really kicked off in the House of Commons when he tried to suggest that the reason why people are poor and unable to live on universal benefits is because they can't cook.
But my invitation is to everybody on that side of the house. Come to Ashfield and work with me for a day in my food bank and see that the brilliant scheme we've got in place, where when people come now for a food parcel, they have to register for a budgeting course and a cooking course. And what we do at the food bank, we show them how to cook cheap and nutritious meals.
And this is the food that he made. But take a real look and think about what he's actually done here, because I don't think many people have an Aldi within walking distance, a team of helpers, and an industrial kitchen with a professional chef to help you make meals at 30 pence a pop. I hate to add to this, but where are the greens? Where's the fresh fruit? Where's the salads? That's nutrition.
On a budget, we can make a meal for about 30 pence a day, and this is cooking from scratch.
It's funny that he says this as if it is the solution to all, but for some people they don't have anything to live off. They might even have £10. And in my video, Causes of Brexit, and I'll leave a link at the end of the video. In the video, we meet Charlie. Charlie is on universal credit. He's hard up, he's not able to find work, even though he used to be a team leader at Asda. After costs of rent and gas and electric, which we all know is going through the roof at the moment, Charlie is left with £10 a month to live off, and he is actively searching for work all this time, which doesn't help because not only is there not much work, the work that he can find is a 0-hour contract, and the work can get cancelled hours before he's meant to actually start. There is a thing called the taper rate. The taper rate is a tax, and it taxes anyone on universal credit for earning 55% of their earnings. And the way they do that is by deducting the universal credit. So the bare minimum that you need to live off, 55% of it is taken away for each pound that you earn. But do not forget, on top of that, if Charlie is working with a company, he is also taxed income tax, national insurance, VAT for anything that he buys, including going on the bus to get to the job, and then on top of that, for every pound he earns, he loses 55 pence on every pound earned. For someone who claims to have worked down the pit, he sure does talk a lot of crap and doesn't understand poverty. And of course, he then gets quite a response from the opposite benches.
Ask me a simple question. Should it be necessary to have food banks in 21st century Britain?
I thank the honourable gentleman for his intervention. He makes a great point, and this is exactly my point. So I invite you personally to come to Ashfield, look at our food bank, how it works, and I think you'll see firsthand that there's not this massive use for food banks in this country. We've got generation after generation who cannot cook properly, they can't cook a meal from scratch, they cannot budget. The challenge is there.
So two things to take from that. Point one, he's blaming the education system. They've been in charge for 12 years. Why haven't they included home cooking in classes? They don't. You don't learn anything like that in school. Not up to the age of 18. Why do you think university halls are such a mess? Don't learn how to cook, don't learn how to clean, and yet he's just said it about his own government. I mean, and as if it's like a shock or something. Our education system's like absolutely ridiculous. It does not teach practical skills on the level that it should. And then comes his second point. He suggests that food banks are just being overused. This is from the Trussell Trust. Since 2010, the number of emergency food parcels handed out by the Trussell Trust, food banks alone, has risen from around 40,000 to 2.1 million in 2021-22. I think this is pretty well summed up on BBC Question Time by Miata Fanbula. Apologies if the pronunciation isn't correct. She's an economist, and she holds the Attorney General accountable for the actions of the government very succinctly.
The choice of heating your home or feeding your kid, they're not doing either. And for me, when we have families on the brink, when we have children going into destitution, when 2 million people in the richest country in the world are skipping meals because they can't afford it, the fact you're not acting, I think, is unforgivable.
There's a lot of hands up.
But is it any wonder that someone like
Mr. Anderson
is part of a Tory party whose leadership is very similar to Mr. Anderson's, and unfortunately for them, this ideology is scarily similar to that of Nazi ideology. It is also scary to see the number of restrictions they're putting on British citizens and their right to protest, to freedom of speech, and a number of other civil liberties and checks on the government.
Britain is competing in an increasingly impatient and globalized economy in which the competition is getting ever stiffer. And no one can ignore the harshness of that competition or the inequality that it inevitably accentuates.
This is like a really shit essay that you would get from a university student who hasn't done their reading. So he's already setting up the premise. He's saying that the world's really competitive, so we've got to do something about it. We've got to realise there's a level of competition.
And I'm afraid that violent economic centrifuge is operating on human beings who are already very far from equal in raw ability.
Now he's pinpointed this within humans, and arguably he's reflecting this upon the UK. So he's saying in the UK there's a natural hierarchy, and there are a group within that hierarchy that are unequal to the rest.
If not in spiritual worth.
Now, I don't know if you noticed there, but he was actually playing around with his wrist. I would suggest that is a bit of nervousness about saying what he's saying. It's sort of bringing to the forefront his actual views, which aren't necessarily going to be taken on board by the public. On top of that, what he's purporting is that there's a spiritual worth within humans. Now, there's so much ambiguity here, but if you were to go along a spiritual line, let's say we go along with Christianity, let's say we go along with Adam and Eve, if we're all from the same group, surely that means there's a level of spiritual equality. But he's saying that isn't the case. This is also a form of race theory as well that was purported in the past, that certain races were of second-class status, or, in some extreme cases, subhuman.
Whatever you may think of the value of IQ tests, it is surely relevant to a conversation about equality that as many as 16% of our species have an IQ below 85, while about 2%, but anyway, 16%, what you want to put up your hands?
And there you have it. He's instantly coming out with something very, very similar to Nazi ideology, but there's going to be a caveat here. What he's going to say is essentially that you need a rich class to support the class that he deems sub to secondary. But while saying that, he will expect that second class to operate underneath the first class. This is a social hierarchical structure, similar to that of Nazi Germany. The big difference is that Nazi Germany exterminated anyone that they deemed to be subhuman. What we're seeing with these policies from the Conservative Party over and over again is that they don't really want to support that group. They don't care that that group commits suicide. That might sound extreme, so let's have a listen to Dominic Raab talking about this.
With the work capability assessment, Napier University and Heriot Watt just released evidence about how it causes almost universal permanent mental health damage. It kills people. I have friends who were institutionalized after going through it. It is an act of violence. And we are dying. And this election is life or death for us.
The raw truth is, the money's got to come from somewhere. And it's very easy.
Let him respond.
It's very easy, and I can think of lots of things that I would like to avoid making difficult decisions on, and lots of areas like the health service or schools where I want to put even more money in. But unless you've got a strong economy, creating the revenue, it's just a childish wish list. We're trying to do our best to get the balance right between responsible public finances and investing in some of those crucial areas you discussed.
You choose to sacrifice tens of thousands of disabled people for the sake of that.
Now remember what he said at the beginning.
I don't support the Human Rights Act, and I don't believe in economic and social rights.
And then remember that they were able to find money for PPE, track and trace, furlough, all of which have been associated and connected to fraud scams. It's funny how they can find money when they need to. And this starts to explain why the benefits system is at such a minimum level. They do not want to invest in it. However, because they're not investing in it, it causes more problems elsewhere. But we're about to get into the real depths of this, because Boris is going to justify why there needs to be a shake-up within that system, and that some of those people in the lower classes can jump up to the top, but they need to have a rough experience to be able to achieve that.
16% have an IQ below 85, 2% have an IQ above 130. And the harder you shake the pack, the easier it will be for some cornflakes to get to the top.
And there you have it. You have something akin to that of what Littlefinger says in Game of Thrones.
Chaos. A gaping pit waiting to swallow us all. Chaos isn't a pit. Chaos is a ladder.
And this is why the Tories are so out of touch. It is unbelievable that this medieval, archaic philosophy is viewed as the norm, the way forward for our society.
The income gap between the top cornflakes and the bottom cornflakes is getting wider than ever. And I stress, I don't believe that economic equality is possible. Indeed, some measure of inequality is essential for the spirit of envy and keeping up with the Joneses and so on. That is a valuable spur to economic activity.
People who I've met sometimes with a few bob and who've got on don't think everybody else should have a few bob and get on. And I think the opposite. I think everybody can have it. And that's where socialism comes from. I think everybody should have a book. I think everybody should have a nice classroom to go to. I think everybody should have the same opportunities.
Honestly, cannot get enough of Clough. And I'm sick to death of Boris. So should you. He is not someone to vote for. He is, quite frankly, a joke and out of touch. Now, the biggest irony of all is that Boris talks about IQ, but Boris did an IQ test 8 years ago on LBC. I thought I'd finish off on a happy note. But before you see Boris take his IQ test, I have to say a big thank you to my YouTube members and to my Patreon supporters. You really help this channel keep going and allow me to produce videos like this, which helps hold the government and politicians to account.
But I have an IQ question for you. Would you ready to take it? It's from an official IQ
This
test.
is not about me.
A man builds a house with 4 sides of rectangular construction, each side having a southern exposure. A big bear comes along. What colour is the bear?
The bear is probably brown. I haven't got a clue what the colour of the bear is, nor is it relevant to this discussion.
White, because the bear is on the South Pole. Try another one.
No, listen, mate.
Take 2 apples from 3 apples. What do you have? Take 2 apples from 3 apples. What do you have?
You've got loads of apples, mate. You've got 1 apple left.
You've got 1 apple.
Listen.
You say you've got 1 apple.
Listen. What we're talking about.
You haven't. You've got 2 apples. You're now batting 0 for 2. Let's just do one more. I went to bed at 8 o'clock last night.
I think we're rather proving the point that I made.
You were the one who brought IQ into the conversation. I went to bed at 8 o'clock in the evening, and I wound up my clock to set the alarm to sound at 9 o'clock in the morning. How many hours sleep would I get before being woken by the alarm? I went to bed at 8 o'clock in the evening.
Well, you know, mate,
I wound up my clock and set it to 9 o'clock in the morning. How many hours sleep did I get?
Well, I slept like a log.
I'm delighted.
I was looking forward to seeing you on LBC 97.3. Where we're waiting for some more sensible questions.
You're declining, are you?
What I'm telling you is that this isn't about.
It's an hour.
What I'm telling you is
this is not. Any of the IQ
this is not
right.
about.
So who are you to lecture about IQ, Mr. Bear?
Exactly. Listen, no one said that IQ is the only measure of ability, but what I have been saying repeatedly is I think that our system is letting down people who do have ability and who could do much better.